Okay. Welcome, Meghan O'Rourke. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you for having me. So nice to be here with you all. I'm gonna turn on a light over here, actually.
Sure.
I'm
It's
good.
great to have you with us. I'm Kathy McCoy, director of the Writers Project at SUNY Adirondack, and we are delighted to have Meghan O'Rourke with us. Meghan is a writer, poet, and editor. She is the author of the New York Times bestseller, The Invisible Kingdom, Reimagining Chronic Illness, right here, from 2022. The best-selling memoir, The Long Goodbye, from 2011, and poetry collections, Sun in Days, right here, from 2017, which was named a New York Times Best Poetry Book of the Year, Once, from 2011, and Half-Life, 2007, which was a finalist for the Patterson Poetry Prize and Britain's Forward First Book Prize. O'Rourke is the recipient of numerous rewards, including a Guggenheim Fellowship, a Radcliffe Fellowship, a Whiting Nonfiction Award, the May Sarton Poetry Prize, the Union League Prize for Poetry from the Poetry Foundation, a Lannan Literary Fellowship, and 2 Pushcart Prizes. Currently the editor of the Yale Review. Oh, is that all? She began her career as a fiction and nonfiction editor at The New Yorker. What a place to start out. Since then, she has served as culture editor and literary critic for Slate, as well as poetry editor and advisory editor for the Paris Review. Her essays, criticism, and poems have appeared in The New Yorker, The Atlantic Monthly, Slate, Poetry, The Kenyon Review, and Best American Poetry, among others. She's a graduate of Yale University, where she also teaches. Please welcome Meghan O'Rourke.
Thank you. Hello. Thank you all for having me. It's always both wonderful to be able to meet by Zoom and also, sad that we're not all in a room together, but this makes so much more visiting possible. So I'm really glad you're here. I'm sitting here in my office where I wrote much of the book, in the attic of our house in Connecticut. So it sort of feels appropriate to be sitting here talking to you about The Invisible Kingdom. I thought I would tell you a little bit about the book. I'll sort of read and talk for a few minutes, and then I'll read actually from the last chapter, which is one of the chapters I wrote earliest, or I wrote part of it earliest, which is about the question of what kind of wisdom can be gained from illness. But I wanted to start by just giving you an overview of why I wrote this book and how I came to write this book. From the beginning, I knew that this particular book was going to be a hybrid of memoir and personal narrative with research, and that I was going to weave those two things together because the personal narrative I was telling could help illuminate and bring to life the research, and the research, well, really, it was impossible to understand my story without doing research. So this book thinks about the fact that the stories we tell about illness usually have startling beginnings. The fall at the supermarket, the lump discovered in the abdomen, the doctor's call. That's how the book begins. But I like to say I got sick the way Hemingway says you go broke, gradually and then suddenly. One way to tell my story would be to say that I got ill just after college in the late 1990s when I began experiencing dizziness, chronic pain, and drenching night sweats, long before any doctor believed I was sick. Another way to tell my story would be to say the illness took hold in the days after my mother died on Christmas of 2008, when I caught a virus, a debilitating fatigue overcame me, my lymph nodes ached for months. Still another way would be to say that it started 3 years later in January of 2012 on a windy beach in Vietnam. My partner and I were reading by the water when I noticed a strange rash on my inner arm. It looks like Braille, I thought. But what was the message? Trying to answer that question ended up leading me on a nearly 10-year quest. In the grips of a malaise I had no name for, and meeting with dismissal from medical professionals, I needed understanding. So as I talk about in the introduction, I turned to literature, science, philosophy, doctors, healers, historians, researchers, and other patients. Along the way, I became interested in the contradictions and complexities of our medical system and the obstacles faced by patients whose illnesses are poorly understood, and in the question of what might help me live with illness, even if I could not overcome it. While there was no single answer, one thing stood out. Above all, I wanted recognition of the reality of my experience, not least so that others might in the future suffer less than I did. And there are a lot of people suffering. So we're all familiar with the ubiquity of long-term illnesses like heart disease and cancer, which are well-defined and viewed as unquestionably real, which is a word I put in quotes. But what is less well known is that there's also a silent epidemic of chronic illnesses that are often marginalized, contested, or even unrecognized. Illnesses that include autoimmune diseases in which the body's immune system mistakenly attacks tissue it is meant to protect, myalgic encephalomyelitis, chronic fatigue syndrome, post-treatment Lyme disease syndrome, or chronic Lyme disease, as many patients call it, dysautonomia, mast cell activation syndrome, fibromyalgia, and now, on a scale that is only beginning to be recognized, long COVID. If every age has its representative signature disease, I contend in the invisible kingdom that this type of chronic illness is ours. That is, it's a condition in which we find pointedly reflected back at us habits of thought that reveal key cultural assumptions and key dominant cultural narratives to us. These illnesses, of course, are distinct from one another, but they're often characterized by dysregulation of the immune system or the nervous system, or both. And those two are powerfully intertwined in our bodies, as we're now learning. Some researchers suspect that there might actually be meaningful overlap in how these illnesses work and in the people who have them, which is to say, if you have one of these illnesses, you may be more likely, it seems you're more likely to have others. They are conditions that modern medicine knows surprisingly little about, and that evidence suggests can be triggered by multiple causes, including the body's response to infections. The category is growing in size. To take one example, autoimmune diseases are rising at what scientists call epidemic rates. They now affect from 24 million to 50 million people in the United States, and the pandemic is only going to contribute to the problem, since it looks like SARS-CoV-2, the virus, can trigger autoimmune disease along with long COVID. So my book, The Invisible Kingdom, aims to understand and reframe the ways we think about this silent epidemic, and the kinds of stories we tell about people living with these poorly understood illnesses. This is something that feels especially urgent to me because we're living through what really could be called an epidemic rise of immune-mediated illness. And immune-mediated is a term we use to describe illnesses where something about the illness itself and the symptoms is caused by the immune system, right? Maybe because there's a persistent pathogen or virus or bacteria there, maybe because the immune system has gone astray in its attempt to fend off that virus. And yet our medical understanding of these conditions lags far behind our understanding of chronic conditions like cancer or high blood pressure. And because the immune system and nervous system are intimately connected in ways we're just beginning to understand, they're often highly responsive to factors like stress and environment and what we might call biography, including trauma and adverse childhood events. So in the book, I contend that immune-mediated illness reveals to us the limits of measurement-based medicine as it currently stands, at least, which is to say, it brings up the question of what we do when people live in bodies that stand at the edge of medical knowledge. These illnesses also reveal to us the pathologies of American individualism, our discomfort with what the poet John Keats, the 19th century poet John Keats, who died of TB, once called being in uncertainties. And the end I argue the epidemic of these illnesses is a stark reminder of our social and environmental interconnectedness. When John Donne, another poet, wrote, "No man is an island," that famous phrase we've probably all heard, he was actually ill with an infectious disease during a pandemic in 1623, lying in his bed. And he could have been offering a framework for how we would come to think of the immune system as a defense system that leaves our bodies porously open to one another, right? No immune system is an island, in a way that the current coronavirus has starkly reminded us of the ways in which our health can be contingent on the health of others and the actions of others. So we each have our own highly personalized immune system, but it is shaped by our history of interactions with others and by social stressors such as poverty, trauma, race, and more, racism. So, I think one of the questions the book takes up is, how did we come to see illness as being really a very individualistic problem, like that we see illness as isolating and something that is your own problem to fix, where in fact, many of the illnesses that we currently die from have social origins or could be, thought about as social problems, caused by the rise of man-made chemicals in the environment, changes in our food system. One of the other big questions the book takes up, you hear the term the title Invisible Kingdom, is this idea that these illnesses are often invisible because we don't currently have great ways to measure them, and our medical system depends on measurement. So that doesn't mean that the illness doesn't exist. It just means we haven't come up with that really easy commercial lab work that is going to show you exactly what's wrong. Some of these illnesses, there are biomarkers, there are things we can look at, but in other cases, we're still searching, like in long COVID, we're still searching for the biomarkers that might be able to differentiate a long COVID patient from someone with something else. So a big question for the book is the question of invisibility and what it does to us when we are suffering, not only alone, but without being seen by others, without having our suffering validated or recognized or supported. So I ask the question of, how can we explain and identify suffering, and how can you live with illness in the social sphere if no one has any grasp of what it is you suffer from? And also, these diseases are often what's called relapsing and remitting. So I ask the question of, how do you describe a disease that's not always there? So I'm going to read a little bit from the very last chapter, which picks up the thread that the book really interrogates, which is that of looking at the kinds of stories we like to tell about illness and how often they're sort of comforting stories, right? And that's what I'm going to pick up and sort of look at and interrogate. And I'll read for about 15 or 20 minutes, since I've already sort of read it and talked for 10. So this is called the wisdom narrative. The stories that we tell about illness are almost entirely about overcoming it, but for illnesses that cannot be overcome, they are about growing wiser as a result of suffering. During my illness, I kept finding that others wanted to assuage my pain by reassuring me of the good things it had brought with it. They had embraced the reassurances of a cultural narrative in which the ravages of illness are offset by the enlightening spiritual knowledge they bring with them. A narrative in which sickness is bearable because it transforms the sufferer. One spring, when I was at my most ill, a friend visited me at my apartment in Brooklyn, and drinking herbal tea beside me on the couch where I spent most of my days, earnestly brought up all the things my illness had taught me. Surely, she said, such lessons were worthwhile. I bridled and then snapped. I would prefer not to have learned any of them this way, to be honest. In the American pop spiritual approach, illness is a vehicle for self-improvement and hard-won acceptance, a line of thinking the sick patient quickly finds everywhere. It shows up in Alice in Bed, Susan Sontag's play about the chronically ill writer Alice James. At one point, a friend blithely encourages Alice, who is at that moment extremely sick, to, quote, want what you are capable of and shrug off the rest. Life is not just a question of courage, Alice tartly replies. So Alice James was a 19th century writer, sister of Henry James, the novelist, and William James, the philosopher, who had been diagnosed with hysteria. And no one could really figure out what was wrong with her, but she was sick all her life. And the idea was that it was, she had used her brain too much and that she was now sick. In fact, she probably had something like an autoimmune disease. In the illness narratives, the anthropologist Arthur Kleinman praises patients who are able to handle their illness with what he calls grace. Onlookers often respond to the experience of chronically ill people by focusing on the supposed positives, presumably because it makes the pain of witness bearable. And of course, the notion of illness as a vehicle for spiritual change has its roots in a Judeo-Christian tradition that emphasizes the instructive, even sacramental, value of human pain. It is true that illness is an experience that tests you and forces you to rebuild your life. The destruction it wreaks makes room for recreation. As Arthur Frank puts it in The Wounded Storyteller, quote, unmaking can be a generative process. What is unmade stands to be remade. But I had read too many letters and diaries written by suffering people to feel sanguine about healthy friends focusing on the spiritual growth illness brings with it. There is a razor-thin line between trying to find something usefully redemptive in illness and lying to ourselves about the nature of suffering. Until we mourn what is lost in illness, and until we have a medical community that takes seriously the suffering of patients, we should not celebrate what is gained in it. At various points when I was most ill and as I began to recover, I wrestled with whether anything good could be said to come out of chronic illness. Does illness bring wisdom? What does it mean to suffer? To answer that, we need to understand in a deep way the types of stories we tell ourselves about illness, and to accept that the meaning of any given illness is unstable, indeterminate, and different from person to person. I got sick. I got worse, I got better. That's how the standard illness narrative goes. But just as I am unable to pinpoint exactly how or when my illness started, I cannot say that it ended. My narrative is not a neat one. Which version of the story of my illness I tell depends on what month, what day, even what hour I do so, and whether my symptoms are in the background or the foreground. I am luckier than I thought I would be when I got acutely sick in 2012. After years of suffering, being treated for a tick-borne illness got me partly better, transforming me from a bedridden person who could not recall basic words like spring to a functioning and often energetic 38-year-old. I have recovered, and yet, though I try not to focus on it, I am still sick. I live with hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, POTS, and autoimmune thyroiditis. I have ongoing fatigue, brain fog, and neurological and connective tissue problems. They are mostly manageable. Sometimes they are not. One recent morning, I woke feeling unwell. Sharp electric shocks ran along my legs and arms. I stood by the sink, unable to do the dishes, twitching in pain. My older son looked up from eating his breakfast and said, "What's wrong, Mommy?" At 4, he has already learned that sometimes I am unwell, despite my best efforts to hide it. It hurts me that he worries for me. It is difficult to look at the shadows of physical suffering clearly, because to do so, I know, is to risk inviting depression or a terrifying apprehension that the world is made of pain. But when I was at my sickest, I resolved that if I got well enough to write about my experience, I would not give false assurances. I would not write letters reassuring those I loved that my life had not been utterly compromised. Now that I am somewhat better, I can tell you the truth. When I was at my sickest, my life was utterly compromised, and my very sense of self was gone. When I was less sick, and there were periods of relief in my illness, I could step back from the experience and take pleasure in the vividness of the blue sky from my bedroom window. But I will not repeat falsehoods. I will not say the wisdom and growth mean I wouldn't have it any other way. I would have it the other way. When you get seriously ill, either with a chronic illness or a grave disease like cancer, your sense of story is disrupted. As Arthur Frank puts it, the body sets in motion the need for new stories when its disease disrupts the old stories. The new stories we tell matter, Frank argues, because they repair the damage that being sick has done to the ill person's self-understanding. Frank identifies three kinds of illness stories: restitution narratives, chaos narratives, and quest narratives. In restitution narratives, the sickness is bearable because the ill people believe that in the end they will get better. Restitution narratives emphasize recovery over the reality of illness. In fact, the restitution narrative could be called the dominant mode of late capitalist illness narratives. As Frank notes, contemporary culture treats health as the normal condition that people ought to have restored. Chronic illness, though, is hard to map onto a restitution narrative. It is almost by definition never a story of overcoming, because the disease's trajectory never fully resolves. And so many sick people find themselves in Frank's second kind of story, the chaos narrative, in which events are told as the storyteller experiences life, without sequence or discernible causality. Chaos is anti-narrative. These stories are hard to hear. The final story is what Frank calls the quest narrative, a story in which the patient has been able to synthesize her experience into a meaning of some kind, although it's usually not the meaning, like recovery, that she thought she'd find when she first got sick. Inherent in the quest narrative is searching for alternative ways of being ill. The quest becomes clear only after the sick person experiences a deeper initiation into the world of illness, identifying the way that she has been transformed by it. The more I talked to sick people, the more I found that what is most disturbing for many of us is that grace has become a kind of moral requirement in sickness. If you must be ill, at least be improved by your illness. And yet the conditions under which grace can emerge may not be present. For one thing, it's nearly impossible to adjust to your new identity when the medical community itself refuses to acknowledge the physical reality of your disease. When you have no name for what ails you, or you are told it's psychosomatic. Then, too, the United States does not treat healthcare as a human right or sick people with dignity. How can you achieve grace if you are losing the job on which you and your children rely, or when you feel you are materially failing those who love you? The narrative of recovery against all odds has a powerful grip on us. In Being Mortal, the surgeon Atul Gawande notes that, quote, "The battle of being mortal is the battle to maintain the integrity of one's life, to avoid becoming so diminished that who you are becomes disconnected from who you were or want to be." But one doesn't necessarily avoid this. I did not remain myself. Instead, I experienced diminishment, the tunnel I never wanted to enter, the culvert that terrified me, the threat I thought I couldn't survive. "It's bearable, and yet I cannot bear it," wrote Alphonse Daudet of Living with Syphilis. I had revised his line in my head. It is unbearable, and yet I bear it. I survived, but it was the nature of the disease to rob me of myself. Frank's insights into our contemporary hunger for framing illness as a kind of quest reminded me of a passage from an essay on virtue by the philosopher Alistair MacIntyre. It makes a simple point, that what the quester thinks a quest is for is never what the quest is for. A traditional medieval quest, MacIntyre argues, is not, quote, "a search for something already adequately characterized," but it is through encountering and coping with the various particular harms, dangers, temptations, and distractions that the goal of the quest is finally to be understood. The quest is, quote, "always an education in self-knowledge." It entails a journey that forces the quester to be present in ways he or she might prefer not to be, and it does not necessarily involve triumph, although some part of me had always thought it did. Rather, the quest involves discovery, turning the quester from a bad reader of circumstance, prone to sentimental expectations, to a good reader, alert to life's unseen dimensions. If the object of your illness quest is simply to get better, you are not yet deep on your quest. As a child, lying on the couch in the summer cabin we visited, I used to read and reread the tale of King Arthur's Round Table. I remember losing myself in a place where fantasy was alive and the shadows in the room felt like doorways into great adventures. Toward the end of the tales, Galahad, who has been prophesied to be the greatest knight of all, goes on a search for the Holy Grail. Although Galahad discovers the Grail, he elects to die while still pure of soul, instead of bringing it back to Camelot, where he would become a creature of worldly concerns again. The goal of his quest has shifted from returning home to achieving spiritual transformation. As a child, reading this for the first time, I was saddened by Galahad's decision. The children's books I'd read had led me to believe that the heroes always came back. When I reread the tales, I used to stop before I got to Galahad's discovery and imagine different outcomes. In retrospect, I see that I was a bad reader from the start, in search of the easy ending, the solution. I read for what allowed me escape. I looked away from the bruises blooming in the body. I kept going back to the false goal of the quest. As a sick person, I did not have that option. I had to become a new kind of reader. And as this reader, I must acknowledge that not all stories are quests. For some people, being ill remains so awful and so taxing that it brings nothing other than chaos. Perhaps coming to grasp this fact is the wisdom that illness brings with it. That illness does change you, that is certain. The word wisdom comes from the Old English words wiz, knowledge, for knowledge or learning, and doom or judgment. Perhaps ill people do, in a sense, become wise through encountering doom, and as a result, they become new versions of themselves, having made it through some of the hazards of the course, experiencing what the poet John Ashbery calls the charity of the hard moments. Those encounters perhaps allow us to see ourselves and our mortal condition more clearly. But it would be false not to observe that this knowledge is born of loss, of resignation to a condition that forces us to give up on aspects of ourselves we had hoped we might develop. Wisdom in this understanding is knowledge coupled with the wound that comes from encountering doom. When I was most ill, I began to think about the fact that wisdom is not a goal, but a process. As a process, it can always break down. I would contend that it does break down as soon as doctors stop recognizing the reality of a patient's illness or dismiss the patient's pain. It can also break down when the suffering recurs without explanation. My own illness's meaning, in other words, derives also from all the ways it was not allowed to mean until I wrote this account of its meanings. At the start of this book, I looked at the rash on my arm and wondered what it meant. I had no way of understanding at the time everything that it would come to mean, or that its meaning lay in the complex immunological processes that led to its manifestation and to all the thoughts that I would have in the years following its appearance. Its fate was mine, and my fate was its, and the I and the it had a far different relationship, I would come to know, from anything I had been capable of conceiving. To become chronically ill is not only to have a disease that you have to manage, but to have a new story about yourself, a story that many people refuse to hear because it is deeply unsatisfying, full of fits and starts, anger, resentment, and chasms of unruly need. My own illness story has no destination. Rather, it is the sum of all of the ways it taxed and surprised me, all the people it threw me into rough contact with, all the accommodations and limitations it brought with it, the suffering I underwent, the pride I felt at times at having endured and at having persevered until I got a diagnosis, the years spent longing for a child before having a child. It is the fact that although I have children, those years of longing remain written on my body and etched into my soul, such as it is. The longing is with me every time I hear my younger son cry from his bed at night, or see him reach his plush, velvety, chubby arms up to me. It fills me with a guilt and overwhelming rush of love for him, predicated on just how unlikely it is that he is in the world. Sometimes I look at him, still a baby, and think I have disassociated. I am adrift in a false reality, a fantasy of escape that helps me endure. I catch myself thinking that I don't have a child, that he's part of a long dream, a deliciousness I dare not enjoy too much, or dare not stop enjoying, lest he be snatched back. But no, I am here in this world, facing his bright being, his young body that wants more than anything to thrive. Inside him, his thymus is an education factory. His T cells are learning what to tag as germ and what to tolerate as self. The macrophages are hungrily eating the toxins that enter through his skin, his food, his breath. Deep in the bone marrow, the B cells learn. I watch him, I put my ear against his heart and listen to the blood thrum with immunity and vulnerability. My illness left an open window in me, through which anything can climb at any time. Thank you. I'll stop there. Thanks so much. I can't hear you guys.
Thank you so much, Megan.
Um,
Questions for Megan? And if anybody on Zoom would like to ask a question, please unmute your microphone on the lower left and then ask. Who has a question? Yes, Jordan? I'm going to have to repeat it, I think, so. Okay, I have a student asking what sort of things help you best in the moment. She's a student who has POTS and she uses salt somehow.
Yeah. So the question is about what helps with POTS?
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So POTS is such a tricky one. I'm sorry to learn that you're living with it, but yeah, salts definitely. And for me, doing seated cardio rehab as my body could tolerate it under the guidance of like a really good cardiologist who understands POTS very, very well. She's a POTS researcher, so that I'm not pushing my body too much, but I'm and crashing, but that I'm getting that kind of steady development of my kind of tolerance for cardio. And it's really important that it's seated because then your nervous system isn't doing all the work of trying to keep you upright. What else helps me? I mean, I have to be really careful about avoiding cold and heat, but especially cold. My body gets cold really easily and that triggers a whole POTS crash. So things like that, just being very aware of temperature, very aware of things like the need to eat small, steady meals. That's a lot of POTS patients. The researchers I talked to said, small, steady meals for the day rather than big meals, and just keeping a really consistent schedule, which is hard as a student and as a parent, is something I try to do, but it's a work in progress.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What was your disease?
He's asking what was your disease, but of course, having read the book, I know you had multiple issues.
Yeah. So, I think part of the point of the book is that while I ended up with a handful of diagnoses, in some ways I still don't exactly know what went wrong and what exactly is causing my symptoms. But I was ultimately diagnosed with, early on I was diagnosed with autoimmune thyroiditis, which is a kind of autoimmune disease in which your immune system attacks and destroys your thyroid. So that was the first diagnosis. And at the beginning, I thought that was the only diagnosis, right? Because that's the kind of narrative we absorb, is that there's like one problem and then you're going to take the medication and you're going to get better. And that's what I thought would happen. But when it didn't, I had to kind of investigate more. So I ended up realizing that I had a genetic condition called hypermobile Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which I mentioned in the reading, that predisposed me to this condition called POTS that the other person asked about, which is postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome. So it's a syndrome in which your nervous system doesn't do all the, when you sit there and you think, okay, I'm going to stand up from my desk and I'm going to go get lunch, you're consciously deciding that. And then a whole set of unconscious processes happen in which your veins constrict to send blood to your head so you don't faint when you stand up and all the blood goes to your feet. So POTS is a disorder of those in unconscious processes. So I have that as well. Yeah. And then I was diagnosed for tick and treated for tick-borne illness, which was pretty clearly the real source of why I wasn't getting better with these other interventions was that I still had a tick-borne illness that was really severe and needed to be treated with antibiotics. And after being treated with that, I did get much, much better to the point where I could write the book.
Yeah. Ah, it's a biggie. What is the biggest challenge in explaining your illness to someone who's healthy?
Yeah, that's a great question. I don't know that I can reduce it to a single large challenge. I think in a way, the work of the book is the answer to that question, which is to say that I became really interested in why in our kind of hyper-diagnostic age in some ways, right? In some ways, we're very keen to diagnose things that once might have just been regarded as part of life. Why was it so hard, not only for me, but many of the people who have similar kinds of illnesses like autoimmune disease to get a diagnosis? So we have research showing us that if you have an autoimmune disease, it takes the average patient 4 doctors and maybe 2 years to end up with a diagnosis, right? That's a long time. That's a lot of labor. That's a lot of specialists. So I was really interested in that question of, when it's that hard to be seen and when it's that hard for the disease to be legible because we don't yet have great diagnostic tools, what happens? So it became for me as a writer, not only a kind of biographical problem, which it was obviously, but also a writerly problem, right? Which is, why is language not up to the task of explaining this to others and making myself be seen, right? I felt like I couldn't really explain what was going on to others, in part because I didn't yet have a diagnosis, right? So that's sort of living in this murky world of, well, this is like this and this is like that, but you end up with these kind of grade school philosophical problems in your head of, well, what if the way I feel is how everyone feels, right? When you don't have a diagnosis, you start to wonder, is this just the human condition and I'm doing a bad job of enduring it? But there were enough strange things that happened that it became clear that something was really wrong. So I think the biggest challenge was really that lack of a pre-existing framework for thinking about the kind of systemic immunological diseases that I'm writing about, because the absence of that framework, I think, is what makes it so hard to talk about, right? We all understand the concept of cancer, but before we grasped it as a medical phenomenon, cancer was seen as, consequence of certain kinds of emotional conditions. Same thing with tuberculosis is a really good analogy, right? Where when tuberculosis wasn't understood, it was seen as a disease of sensitive souls. And it really wasn't until it was first identified as a bacteria, and then in fact, 20 years later, there was a treatment for it, that people stopped this kind of reflexive desire to see the disease as psychological. So I think one of the hardest things was just tracing that history through the book and showing that, we really do have this tendency to psychologize things we don't yet understand. So anything we don't understand gets kind of treated as though it's psychological, as opposed to creating a gray space for, there's a lot we don't yet know, right? Science doesn't know everything yet. So how do we conceptualize that? What kind of story do we tell about it as a culture? What kind of story does science tell about that to patients? And what story do patients tell? So I think trying to get all of that in the book was the biggest challenge. That's a great question.
Nancy?
This is a more question about the writer's life, Megan. You've been very intensely an editor and have written successfully in 2 genres at least. And can you talk a little bit about how those 2 sides of being a writer maybe have informed each other or maybe gotten in each other's way? But how do you balance those 2?
The 2 sides being editing and writing.
Yeah.
Yeah. Definitely. That's such a great question. So, hi. So, for me, they've definitely informed one another. It's hard for me sometimes to disentangle exactly how, but I do think that having worked as an editor as I did at the New Yorker before I kind of taught myself to write long form narrative nonfiction, gave me the confidence that, writing is really this process, right? That you don't have to have a perfect first draft, that in fact, your job is just to get something down as, as good as you can make it, and to be learning and thinking about storytelling as you do that. But it really taught me that, you can edit pieces to make them much, much better. And so I think that gave me the confidence as a poet to say, hey, I'm going to write a memoir, which I had never done and I hadn't really been formally trained in doing other than being an avid reader. So I do think editing kind of first gave me that confidence of seeing this as a kind of practice that you can get better at. You can read books and take very practical things from them. Like I would sort of devour other memoirs, and I would read Janet Hobhouse and be like, how does she characterize her mother? And I would read Philip Roth and think, how does he build scenes when he's writing about his father and patrimony, and so all these things I just kind of tried to like be a magpie and collect. And I think that was really due to my being an editor and thinking that way as an editor too. So I have a lot of patience with the revision process. I feel like 90% of my writing, shockingly, gets done in the revision process. And that comes from being an editor. The challenge, of course, is that as an editor, certainly now I'm running a magazine, I'm accountable to a lot of people. I have writers writing for me. I feel, like I want to be accountable to them and to my staff. And so it impinges on that sense that I certainly need as a writer of being able to get lost in my head and kind of disappear from the world and find a secret space that no one can impinge on. That's that creative space, that space in which I can think and really process and write. So that's a really pragmatic challenge. But otherwise, I think the two go well together for me, in part because the writer's life is a lonely one, right? And it's full of doubt and self-questioning. And so I like to be able to take my passion for writing and reading and my skills around it and put that in the service of others, right? I never feel tons of doubt and self-questioning as an editor. I'm really there to kind of serve as the caretaker and hopefully the kind of doula of another person's piece. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you, she said. Other questions? Yes.
What kind of audience were you trying to reach? I don't know.
He's asking what kind of audience you were trying to reach.
With this book, yeah. I mean, this book is really written for everyone. It's obviously written for patients, people living with any kind of chronic condition who feel kind of lonely and unseen in that condition, but it's very much a kind of detective story. I mean, I read you some of the thinkier parts of it, the very beginning and the very end, but the story in the middle is driven by events and what happened, and it's told as a detective story, and it has a lot of pivoting to think about our current medical system and its strengths and its limitations, or why we tend to think about disease as the sign of a personal characteristic, right? So I think it's, in that sense, I wanted it to be, the quest in the book turns out to be the quest of learning, not the quest of recovery, right? Of learning and changing. So in that sense, I wanted it also to be for clinicians and medical researchers and for everyone, for anyone who's knows someone with, migraines or autoimmune disease or long COVID. So it is, in my mind, very much a book for everyone.
Decided to get a copy from my rheumatologist, by the way.
Awesome. My rheumatologist just read it. She was like, oh, in fact, my kid's pediatrician just read it. She's like, it's so great. It's like a detective story. I was like,
I have a question about, I'm intrigued by, excuse me, your, and identify with your battle, especially early on in the book. Battle's a terrible metaphor, but you know what I mean. Your struggle to maintain an inherent sense of ambition in the face of people who are saying either get over yourself or go to bed, How would you advise somebody to keep the fire lit without sort of overdoing it?
I mean, that's such a good question and so important. And I don't know that I have incredible wisdom on it, except to say that I think is the question of living with any kind of chronic condition is, how do I keep going and living my life to the fullest while knowing that there's going to be ups and downs, and if I overdo it, I'm gonna suffer, right? I'm gonna really be impaired. And I think that navigating that is one of the great challenges of the kind of chronicity, right? And it's one of the challenges that brings us up against these philosophical and ethical questions about what is a good and meaningful life, and what does good care look like, and what as a sick person or a person dealing with, the body's limitations, do we want other people to know, and what do they need to know or not need to know? So, I'm answering your question with questions because I think that is the question for me, right? Is how one does that. I mean, pragmatically speaking, I have my very particular set of hacks and kind of pretty strong understanding of my limitations. I have to sleep, and I have to eat well, and I have to get very particular kind of exercise. And if I don't do those things, everything will fall apart. And sometimes it doesn't happen, and things kind of fall apart, and I have to reassemble them. So I think when I was really, really sick, I had such bad brain fog that it was hard to find language, and I couldn't write in any sustained way. And so, but I knew that writing was key to my sense of identity and selfhood. So I told myself that all I had to do was write one sentence a day or one line of poetry a day, and that line could be kind of like an aphorism. So my third book of poems, Sun and Days, has all these poems that are kind of written line by line, almost like aphoristically, where the lines don't have to connect to one another, but in some ways they're taking up a similar question.
We read that also. I was actually wondering if you wouldn't mind choosing a poem from Sun and Days, if you have it lying around.
I don't have it here. Yeah, wait, hang on. There might be one online though.
Meanwhile, while Megan looks up her poetry, if anybody online would like to post a question in chat, that's one way to get your question out. Anybody in the room have another question?
Looks like there's one.
Yes.
Let's see, there's just a comment. Let's see, I can read. Hang on, let's see, is this? Yeah, sure, I can read this poem, The Night Where You No Longer Live, which is really comes out of grieving my mother, and this was sort of one of the last poems I wrote about grieving her after some time had passed, and I was really thinking about the question of how do you keep having a conversation with someone who is deeply important to you and who's no longer alive, but is still there for you, right? What is that conversation like? What are those questions like? And so the poem is written in these kind of aphoristic lines that are questions, but there's no question mark, because that was my way of trying to denote that I didn't expect a response back, right? That there's a kind of white space or silence at the end of that question. So let me read that for you. That's in Sun and Days. The night where you no longer live. Was it like lifting a veil? And was the grass treacherous, the green grass? Did you think of your own mother? Was it like a virus? Did the software flicker? And was this the beginning? Was it like that? Was there gas station food? And was it a long trip? And is there sun there, or drones, or punishment, or growth? Was it a blackout? And did you still create me? And what was I like on the first day of my life? Were we two from the start? And was our time an entrance or an ending? Did we stand in the heated room? Did we look at the painting? Did the snow appear cold? Were our feet red with it, with the wet snow? And then what were our names? Did you love me, or did I misunderstand? Is it terrible? Do you intend to come back? Do you hear the world's keening? Will you stay the night? So that's a poem from Sun and Days.
That's so moving. We have a bunch of questions now.
Okay.
What was yours?
Sorry. Questions about the medical field itself. What does the medical field need to do differently based on your experiences?
This is one of our nursing professors asking, what does the medical profession need to do differently based on your experiences?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is one of the questions the book takes up pretty seriously and extensively. And of course, it's a question that one can never answer fully and successfully, right? Because I think we really do need structural reform that's going to require a lot of different forces to come together and reimagine how we deliver healthcare. I think there's a couple things that I do think we can point to. One is the need for centers that deliver care for what are called complex infection-associated chronic illnesses and autoimmune diseases. And I know there is now an autoimmune disease center in Pennsylvania at this hospital that I reported on. I reported on their center. There is a complex infection-associated chronic illness center coming soon, I think in New York City, which is going to be a really big deal. And so I think we need that. We need that coordinated care that centers can offer. But more philosophically, and perhaps more urgently, we need to really put patients at the center of care, and we need to understand that care has material beneficial effects for patients, in particular empathetic care. And there's numbers of studies, study after study, that show that empathy's effects are as real and as measurable as the effects of some of our strongest medications for long-term chronic illness, such as diabetes or IBS. So we need to empower medical professionals and nursing professionals to have the time and the space and the bandwidth really to deliver that care. And of course, the pressures on time and the bureaucracies and the paperwork and all of that is, I think, what is threatening that capability. So that's one of the things that I talk about. But really listening to patients and recognizing that sometimes what patients want is not only, of course, we want to be healed. Of course, we dream of a cure. But in the absence of that, the act of validating and recognizing and seeing is such a powerful one. And one of the most amazing moments I had with a doctor which I talk about in the book, was with my neurologist early on. She had no idea what was wrong with me, but she looked at me and she said, "I can see that you're suffering. I'm sorry that you're suffering. I don't think I'm going to be able to help you, but I believe you, and I see it, and I have other patients like you, and I can put you in this research study, but I don't know what's wrong." So that frank, connection, like really talking to me like a person, just helped me so much in ways that I don't even know if she knows to this day.
Thank you for that. Okay, we've got a bunch of questions in chat here. Someone said, "Thank you. This was so meaningful, and I cannot wait to read your book." Jake says, "Does the book cover support for those that are ill?" Oh, does the book cover support for those that are ill? And also how to explain to others that are not chronically ill, how to understand what you'll go through, especially complexities of tick-borne illness.
Yeah. I mean, the book is very much a narrative. So it's not, it's not a book with like action points or, kind of here's where to go next. It's really supposed to animate the lived experience of illness, and in that way, hopefully bring comfort and consolation to readers and a sense of support. I do talk a little bit about various advocacy groups and patient support groups and online groups, but it's not a book with like a kind of a checklist or a here's where you should go. It's really just a literary narrative of what happened with a lot of research about why we're in the problem we're in. But I often point people to online support groups and to different advocacy groups that are doing a good job, depending on. It's really hard with tick-borne illness, as you so eloquently get it. I mean, it's very hard to sort through expertise versus, people who are presenting themselves as having expertise but don't really have it. And I did not attempt to kind of clear through that thicket. But I know that the iLads website is one that a lot of people trust. It's a huge issue and a huge problem. That's why we need these centers. We need centers where people are vetted and also able to treat the complexities of tick-borne illness and understand and are open-minded about that, so that patients have a sense of, I'm going to someone with credentials, but also who's not going to dismiss me. So that's a really tough one.
Emily asks, which one do you like more, poetry or story writing? And is one easier for you than the other? And to piggyback on that, I noticed, of course, there are clear parallels between the lyrical writing in The Invisible Kingdom and the illness-inspired poetry in Sun and Days. So what would you say about choosing genre, preferences for genre, ease of genre?
Yeah. Well, clearly I can't choose. I mean, after I wrote one book of poetry, and then my next book was a book of poetry. Well, no, my next book was the memoir about my mother's death. And then I also published a book of poetry that was very much centered on her death. And then now I've published a book of poetry very centered on my illness and a memoir. So I guess that's a long way of saying that one reason I write in different forms is I'm very excited by the possibilities afforded by each form, right? And the kinds of inquiries that a genre or even a structure or even a subgenre kind of allow and even solve for you in certain ways. So one reason I wrote poems about illness was I was actually writing The Invisible Kingdom, and I felt very stuck because I felt like the language was sort of making everything sound like I understood, like it was simple, like the problem was simpler than it was. And I realized I had to stop and go write some poems because I wanted to find a language for the experience that was kind of outside of our transactional narrative language for the day-to-day, and that in some ways was able more fully to embody the experience's own resistance to being told, right? Because there's so much white space, and the line break is kind of just space of mystery in a poem, like what happens in the line break and how do you get to the next line? And all that was really interesting to me as I thought about the problem of communication that I was writing about, that someone asked about earlier, which is like, how do you make this mysterious experience, mysterious to others, legible to them? So I stopped and I wrote Sun and Days, and I wrote, in fact, these two kind of hybrid essays or lyric essays at the heart of Sun and Days, where I tried to actually merge the forms of the lyric and the essay and bring them together. That was really important to me in terms of kind of unlocking the rest of the narrative work I wanted to do here, because the writing in this book is meant to be a lot more accessible in some ways. And as we talked about earlier, to speak to a broader array of people and to kind of consciously pull them in and sort of draw them along the narrative. Like I really tried to get the reader hooked and curious, like what's wrong and what's going to happen to her. And I kind of used techniques from Nancy Drew, I use like suspense techniques a little bit. But I couldn't really do that until I had come to understand my own position in relationship to language's limitations in describing this experience. So I really love both modes, right? Because in this mode, I'm going to reach more people. I'm really speaking to the reader, to many readers. In the poems, I'm more trying to figure something out for myself about the possibility of language. And I'm not thinking quite as much about a reader, the reader, any reader.
Excellent. Leela asks, could you compare and contrast people dealing with autoimmune diseases and people dealing with chronic depression?
Compare and contrast in what in what way? Like,
That was in the chat, so I guess you could take that any way you like, unless Leela wants to chime in right now.
sure. I mean, medically, their experiences and struggles. I mean, I don't report on chronic depression, so I don't think I should compare and contrast, because I don't think I've talked to enough people with chronic depression to be able to adequately compare and contrast that. But what I can say is that, as I talk about in the introduction, people with autoimmune disease, myalgic encephalomyelitis, or chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, et cetera, are often met with this kind of reflexive categorization of their disease as being exclusively a mental illness, which presents a barrier to proper care and to research, because their illness is being misread as exclusively, a mental illness. Now, what can be tricky is that a lot of diseases that are driven by inflammation, that catch-all term that really describes a biological process in the body by which the immune system is very, very highly active, inappropriately active in parts of the body. Often that inflammation can affect the brain as well. And so there is evidence that people living with, autoimmune disease or certain other diseases can have a higher incidence of kind of the comorbidity of depression. That's not always the case at all, but sometimes people do. Then too, there's the reality that if you live with chronic illness, we know that the challenges of chronic illness itself, especially the structural challenges, the loneliness that I talked about, can result in a kind of situational chronic depression, right? Not so much the biological thing that comes on mysteriously, almost out of nowhere, but more very explainable. I'm depressed because, I was a runner and now I can't run, and I've lost my community because my community was running. So I think part of the work we have to do, I sometimes laugh in a dark way, because I think when I think about, it's so fascinating to think about the past, and you're like, how could they not? What was it like to think that fever was a disease? In the 19th century, they thought fever was the disease, and different kinds of fevers, like a dry fever versus a sweating fever, signaled different diseases. And so sometimes I think about, what are the people of the future going to look at in our world today and kind of, scratch their head at? And I think it's the way that we talk about mind and body as if they're separate things, right? We obviously know they're not. We treat depression as a biological disease in the brain. And yet there's this way in which, if you're a chronically ill patient going to a neurologist, they'll be like, hey, maybe you should see a psychiatrist, you have anxiety, as if without really investigating the possible inflammatory root of the neurological symptoms as being non-psychiatric in nature, right? So that's something that certainly came up in my research, where I interviewed 100 people with chronic illness, and I think 91 or 92 of them had been told that they were simply experiencing anxiety or depression, and that they didn't have what's called an organic illness, which means an illness rooted in the body. This term bothers me because the brain, by the way, is in the body, but somehow that's the distinction. So they had been told, you don't have an organic illness, you need to see a psychiatrist, or and be on medication, and 91 of the 100 had then been given a very clear-cut diagnosis of like lupus or multiple sclerosis or something else, like within 18 months. But at the time they had gone to doctors, those diseases weren't fully detectable on tests yet, because autoimmune disease, this is changing, but we do not have good tests for them. So as the leading researcher in the country put it to me, often we can't test for the problem until 80% of the organ that's being damaged by the immune system is already gone or dysfunctional. So if you think about that, right, at that point, the train is way off the tracks. 80% of, your thyroid is gone, 80% of your liver, whatever it might be. So, I think that the one thing I can compare and contrast is, I think that there's this, it's not hard if you think you're depressed these days to go get care from a mental health professional. The challenges around depression are more the internalized stigma that prevent us from realizing that we're depressed, right? Whereas I think if you are an autoimmune patient early on in your disease, it can be quite hard to get physicians to recognize that in fact you have an organic disease.
Meghan, I can't thank you enough here. I know you have to go, so I don't want to hold you. There is a question if you wanted to tease us with anything you're working on.
Oh, about what I'm working on. Yeah, I'm not ready to talk about it publicly, but I am working on another work of nonfiction that takes up, some questions around kind of middle age and also the Me Too movement. But yeah, that's about all I can say right now.
Well, thank you. Thank you so much. And wish you lots of health and lots of writing time.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me. So nice to meet you all. Thank you for spending this beautiful day, an hour of it with me. Have a wonderful night. Bye.
Thank you.